Hello again, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and just a kind of an extra random show for you, really, because most of our shows this week are in the morning because of dealing with the time difference between here in Normandy and Australia. But John Buckley contacted me a few weeks ago and said that his book is coming out, and I thought, great, we'll talk about that. And well, I'll introduce him and talk about the book in a minute. But anyone watching this who is either a military tour guide, historian, even just enthusiast or war film aficionado, we've all been down the pub, metaphorically or literally, and we've discussed the alternative scenarios, and if only so and so had done that, if I was this general in 1941, I'd have done that, and we kind of lay out our arguments and usually disagree about them. But in this case, John has taken it another step further with actually a book that outlines 8 decisions made in World War II by you are either an MP or a general or a commander, and you are faced with the situation as it was in the war, and John Buckley, that is our guest, lays out the alternatives to you, and you have to make your decision. Then you move to a certain part of the book, just like those old books I read when I was a kid, those 80s kind of Dungeons and Dragons kind of make your own adventure book, where if you want to go into the cave and try and defeat the dragon, go to page 97, and we all had fun with that. And this is what this is. So John Buckley, he's been on a couple of shows before, notably talking about the historiography of the Normandy campaign. He's been on We Have Ways, of course, several times. He's highly regarded for his very brilliant books about World War II, particularly about the Normandy campaign, Armour. And he teaches professor of history at the Wolverhampton University. So he comes with all the possible qualifications one would need for this. So without further ado, good evening, John. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Yes, all good here.
So this book, I mean, you say in the beginning of it, but and by the way, the links to purchase the book are in the description below, as usual, folks. I mean, you say it kind of was born out of a market garden tour to the Netherlands and those kind of discussions you have of the what ifs. And it seems to me it's a really good idea to have about, I'll do a book with alternative scenarios. But I'm guessing that when you actually sat down with an empty bit of paper, it was harder than you thought it was going to be to actually build up a structure where you put these situations in a sense that you can allow people to make a decision. So take us a little bit through how that process was for you.
It was a challenge, both for myself and the publishers, in terms of firstly choosing the scenarios, but also the structure in the way that we wanted to put it together so that you could make a set number of choices, but make it manageable in the context of a book. The first idea, and the first pitch idea, was the Churchill or Halifax as Prime Minister in May 1940, and then the choices and things which would flow from that. But the first thing I knew about 13 different options and streams and threads and things that you could go down, and that was just completely unmanageable. So we had to rein it back in again into something where you reduced it to key choices at particular moments. And then I decided it needed to be really from the perspective of an interested party who would be either providing advice or oversee what was going on, and then trying to reflect how they might then shape the decision. So you kind of put in the position of, for example, in that scenario, one of them is the chief whip of the Tory party, David Margesson, and he's deciding who should he corral the Tories backing Churchill or Halifax, and the pressure's playing upon him, and then you make that judgment call as to which of those two options you want to go with. And then it takes you down a number of different options and scenarios, and the choice you make can lead to another one, or it can lead to a dead end, or it could lead you to some kind of really interesting or different kind of scenario where you might have to think about another choice. But also, you don't want to take it too far, because if you go too many steps down an alternative path, it starts to get out of control. There are so many variables. It brings in so many other different threads from different parts of the war that it starts to lose a bit too much credibility, shall we say, so we just want to take it 2 or perhaps 3 different steps further on in terms of where you might make the choice. But you're also right in that 8 scenarios was just about management. I mean, there are all sorts of others which we could have played with, and some of which have been kind of done before. That one of them was about D-Day going disastrously wrong, or the choices of things which have flown from that. But I mean, there are different options on that. Possibly there was another one I toyed with, which a friend of mine suggested, which was even thinking before the war, what would have happened if there'd been a war in 1938, instead of a Munich agreement, what would have been the outcome if there'd been a war then? So you could have made a choice about that, but there are only so many things you could fit in, and there are lots of other scenarios where you could play the same kind of thing. But one of the things was to try and identify the way in which decisions are made. I mean, as you just said, that we all like to ruminate about it, and sat chewing the fat over war films and different options, and that was a mad decision. Why did they do that at that time in the war? Clearly, that made no sense. And what was interesting with this was that actually, when you look at it, it kind of reinforces the idea that the people making these decisions, they're not dumbasses, they're not stupid people. They make decisions based upon the available evidence around them, and they have to balance the possible outcomes and lead to what a choice at the time makes a degree of sense. And it's, even if you know what the historical outcome may be, the reality is that at the time that those decisions were being made, those people didn't. So it's sometimes interesting to explore that the moment at which they make that choice, what would have been the consequences if they had gone that, and for legitimate reasons. Most of these decisions are not stupid decisions, even if in retrospect they look like it. So I wanted to explore that a little bit, the decision-making process.
And that's the difference with, I don't want to keep talking about those old 80s adventure games, but those things were complete fantasies. We're going into them as a teenager. I didn't know what the author's ambition was. I didn't know where he was going for it. And of course, with this, is that a lot of people reading this book will know the actual outcome. They will know what happened at Midway. They will know whether or not we dropped the atomic bomb, and so on and so forth. So I was interested as to how I would try and reset my brain a bit and say, okay, try and just listen to or read what John is saying here. Try and put myself in that frame of mind. And I was pleasantly surprised how quite easy it is to actually put yourself back in time and go, okay, now remove that baggage of knowing what happened, and the way you break down here's the situation, here's what they knew, just a simple reminder that we need to be given that Churchill wasn't universally popular in 1940, for example, that we know it's true, but we do kind of forget it a bit because of this status he's acquired since then. And we know the outcomes of some of these battles and campaigns, but when you go back, you realize actually how little information sometimes they had there. And again, you had to come up with 8 scenarios where it is down to a single kind of decision. Because as you say, if we did done Normandy, if we talked about what went wrong, could have gone wrong on D-Day, it would have been probably lots of little things. It wouldn't have been one person in a position to have sorted out all of them. But in this, the way you've laid it out, you are, in McCluskey, for example, in Midway, you are with one person on one flight, giving him a single decision to make. And that was my favorite one. Midway was my favorite of the 8. I mean, I don't know why, but because I realized that when you outlined the other decision, that it wasn't a bad one. I mean, it was, but at the time it was completely, it would have been justified. The person would have said, yeah, this is why I did it. And it was clever how you did that. So just run through what the 8 scenarios are, so that just briefly, not
okay,
but the 8 scenarios.
I mean, there's the first one is about the decision about whether Halifax or Churchill become prime minister in May 1940, and what the consequence of that would have been. Would there have been more chance of a deal a few weeks later? What would have been the consequences of a Halifax premiership in 1940-41? And we don't want to overplay the fact that Halifax gets a bad deal in the history of the Second World War, but he's perhaps overstated a little bit. So that was one. That was quite interesting. The next one was about the Mediterranean campaign, and one of my kind of favourites was this idea of O'Connor not stopping in February 1941, but going on to Tripoli. Which is one of those favourite. If only they'd done that. I mean, in retrospect, that seems like a really obvious decision to have made, but that actually it was quite interesting to throw the other angles in. There were strategic, diplomatic, political reasons why it didn't make any sense, and
Well,
although
that was my second favourite, by the way.
yeah, that was quite fun in that in retrospect, it probably was the wrong decision to stop, but you can see why they did it, and at the time, it probably was the right decision. It just because it plays out differently. The whole situation with Greece and Turkey and so on. At the time, there was a real concern that the Turks might have been drawn into being friendly with the Axis powers at that stage, particularly if the British don't try and defend Greece and so on. So there are all sorts of reasons for that. So that was quite interesting. There's one about the bomber offensive, about the various choices and the move towards area bombing rather than precision bombing, particularly by the RF Bomber Command, because they have to confront those particular choices, and what might have happened if there'd been a greater emphasis on drawing in the bomber offensive until such time as precision bombing or a different kind of use of bombing might have been available, and the kind of consequences of that. And you get some kind of differences from that. I mean, that also finishes with the idea of whether Harris should have been sacked in January 1945 for maybe bending the decision making of the chief of the air staff a little bit too much and breaking the spirit. So that was quite interesting as well. There's one about Casablanca and the battle between Marshall and Brooke about the decision of how you which ways in which you might win the war effectively. And that was kind of interesting, really, because I've always, being a Brit and a fan of Brooke, the great man, the clear-sighted, logical thinker, and so on. Back from the days when seeing, you might have seen Churchill and the Generals with Timothy West.
Yeah, great.
Eric Porter playing Brooke and everything. 12, 13 years old, I thought it was absolutely fantastic. So Brooke was always a big hero. The more I dug into this and the process of the decision making, the more I started, actually, Marshall's got a point here. And you can't win the war in the Mediterranean. So I'm drawn more now to seeing that Brooke overplayed that hand a little bit. And that was kind of quite interesting. So following that process, and that ultimately leads to the possibility, if Marshall gets his own way at Casablanca, which is highly unlikely, but if he had, because the Americans are really undercooked in their preparations for that conference, but if he had, and he may well have forced a landing in northern France in 1943, and I mean that's been explored by various writers about the consequences of that. And it's quite interesting as well to play with the idea of MacArthur being brought back as chief of the army. Army staff under Roosevelt at that time, because Marshall goes to lead the invasion, and then MacArthur manages to manipulate it to a position that it gets cancelled in order to concentrate resources on the Pacific, which I thought was kind of entertaining in a way. It's slightly implausible. We have there's a scenario, Market Garden, the decisions about whether it should have gone ahead and at what point it might have been, the plan might have been changed or cancelled, and the key decisions and those shaping it and so on, and partly around Browning, but also about Lewis Brereton and so on, where they may or may not have pulled the plan, and what could it have been made to function any more effectively by dropping paratroopers south of Arnhem rather than to capture the bridge immediately. Then there's one on Midway, which was quite fun to do, because one of the first books I ever read as a kid was Peter C. Smith's book on the Battle of Midway. For all its, there are maybe some faults and things with it, but I was absolutely captivated by the whole Pacific campaign and carrier battles and things. That was a real big interest for me for a long time. And following that through, and I saw a while ago a recommendation of yours on the channel about Shattered Sword, which I picked up, and that's a fantastic book. It really was really impressive, and that led me then to various other things which followed up on McCluskey's a really good book on Wade McCluskey himself. Somebody did a biography of him, which is really impressive, and various things about looking at how the aircrew operated and the kind of personalities involved at Midway. And those key. I like that one as well because it's multi-layered. Only 2 or 3 of them get down to really the frontline fighting. The Market Garden one does clearly in terms of the deployments, but this one does. And the idea of you're placed in the position of flying a Dauntless at some point, and you're looking for the Japanese fleet, and have they gone north or south? McCluskey's got to make that key decision, and getting into the mind of those people, even if it's only a little bit, you can only get an inkling of it. Was quite entertaining. And then the final one, I think this is the 8th one, was the whole idea of the bomb, and the development of the atomic bomb, and then ultimately its deployment. And I mean, the inspiration for that, the starting point was I saw a play by Michael Frayn a few years ago, Copenhagen, which was it eventually turned into a film actually with Daniel Craig playing Heisenberg, the starting point is the meeting in Copenhagen in September 1941, where Heisenberg goes to see Niels Bohr, and Heisenberg later in life said he was trying to explain the Germans were trying to make an atomic bomb, but he was trying to stop it. And then was he or wasn't he? And Bohr then has to make a decision about whether to tell the Allies, or how much to tell them, or what information, or how to discuss it with Heisenberg. So that was a nice starting point. And then from that, it flows. The Americans are then woken up to the idea that mainly at the behest of the British, or Mark Oliphant, an Australian, you've got to get your act together. The Germans could be making a bomb. Now, in retrospect, we now know the Germans were never going to make a bomb because they'd driven out so many Jewish scientists and the expertise that they held, that they were way behind the curve on that. But the Allies don't know that. So the process which leads then to the deployment of the bomb, or whether to deploy it, and then that leads to the idea of whether or not Operation Downfall, the first stage being Olympic, and so on, the invasion of Japan in late 1945, the consequences of that, and Russian involvement in the Far Eastern War. There are all sorts of possibilities around that. So I think that's the 8 scenarios, isn't it? So
I think so, and it's the balance to me was striking it between kind of making it entertaining to a sense, in that the people who are buying it, who buy proper military history, that this is about this campaign here, will buy it because it sounds like a little bit of an interesting kind of fun night off kind of exercise. But at the same time, when you're talking about something like the bomb, it can't be too, you've got to be serious about it. You can't be flippant about it. It's a real situation. And I think you strike the balance very well with kind of, let's have a bit of fun with the idea of taking decisions, but don't forget there are implications here. And I think the Mediterranean one reminded me as well. I was talking to Michael Nyberg about Vichy France recently, is that we have this idea of the Americans and British sort of towards the end of the war, very much working on the same kind of track. We're going in the same direction. There's a few little problems here and there, but in 41, 42, there's very, very different ideas about where the focus should be put, and indeed how America treated Vichy and how Britain perceived Vichy, and the Mediterranean, definitely lots of national difference in how they thought that campaign should be managed. And so reminding ourselves that period was interesting, because both countries are kind of working out what's our ultimate game here. What are we thinking about? And it brings up the question, as you did in the book, of empire and the future beyond the war, that is part of the reasoning of people like Churchill and others, because they're thinking long term. Yes, anything that causes you to kind of question and that is good. And I think that's because I want to ask you next, apart from the kind of the pure entertainment value of being a general and making the decisions, what kind of military historian, what kind of World War II buff learn from this? What were your hopes for them to learn from this?
I think about how decisions are made. And at the time, I've always been fascinated by how a senior commander makes key decisions and what informs them, or the process. And this is partly work trying. So there's a Montgomery and his kind of, the attitudes, and there's lots of stuff about him not really having a modern view on what leadership or command may be. But I think there's more to it than that, and I think he's maybe intuitively rather than in terms of being a sophisticated thought through process, but there's more going on. So part of it was exploring that, and it's about how people make decisions at the time and the pressures that are playing upon them. And part of this, I think, is we use this in teaching. I've used this quite for a lot of years in terms of we do role plays, and where people have to do a brief on key decisions, have to debate it amongst a group of students as to what are the motivating factors behind certain people's actions. So one of them, for example, is about the Halifax-Churchill debate in May 1940. I was doing that this very weekend, just gone, and a group of people were arguing about, do we do a deal? Do we try and get out of the war? And there's a logic to that. It's not stupid to view Halifax's choice on that as being just wrong. There was a logic to it. I think Churchill's argument was better, and that was partly why he wins. But we've also done for a long time strategy games and getting people and putting them into positions where they have to make key decisions in environments. And we do double-blind games where there's a team. We do one in the Pacific for the Eastern Solomons campaigns and battle in September 1942. And we have an American team and a Japanese team, and they've got to maneuver their fleets around, and there's a brief, and they have to do a strategic overview. What's interesting about that is how people make decisions in those situations. I think, as we've discussed, in some cases, so the students who are doing that don't know the outcome. Some of them do, some of them are well read in their subject. Some of them are very smart, but they might not necessarily know the context. These are sometimes young people, 19 and 20 and so on. So their perspective on it is slightly different. And how they make those decisions sometimes throw some light about how decisions are made under pressure and in battle situations or campaign situations. And they start to see things in a way that we don't, because we sometimes carry baggage because we know what the outcome is. And one thing we've done that Eastern Solomons battle, 20 times over the years, and the Americans hardly ever win. They always get beaten by the Japanese and in that battle. And it's interesting because there are kind of certain factors which mean it's quite difficult to get a result out of that. I mean, historically, it's kind of a draw, I guess, but it shows that maybe to a degree why people make decisions at times under pressure lead you in different directions for legitimate reasons, which might not always work out effectively. And in the book, that's what partly I was trying to do, that people making those decisions don't make them feel because they're being stupid or because it's ill thought through. It's at that particular moment, it appears to be correct. And putting yourself in the position of being an advisor to Monty or an advisor to Marshall, or you're trying to deal between Brooke and Marshall at Casablanca, and Jack Dill, for example, he's the peace broker at the conference, and that was quite interesting because they approach it in a particular way with those pressures playing upon them. Actually, one of the fun ones as well, I didn't mention it before, was the one about Stalin's war.
Yes, yeah, of course, yeah.
That was quite entertaining because of the peculiar nature of Soviet decision making and the way in which high command in Moscow works, and all the mythology and the stories, probably apocryphal now, or in some cases inventions. That was more difficult because the idea of Stalin having a kind of a breakdown in July 1941 after the Germans invade, and he goes and hides in his dacha outside Moscow, and then Molotov and the others have to go and get him to come back and save the day. And the story, of course, being that Stalin was concerned that they were going to turn up and execute him before screwing up the revolution and letting it all go and handing the Soviet empire to the Germans. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that may well have been an invention, but it's kind of a nice tipping point in terms of well, maybe if he had been killed, or if they got rid of him, or something like that, what would the consequences of that have been? If Molotov perhaps had become premier at that time, and whether if they'd retreated from Moscow at the end of 1941, as the Germans were closing in, what would the consequences of that have been? And other people have kind of explored some of those ideas, but putting it together into a string makes it interesting, because you can see why they might have made decisions to replace certain leaders, or and that's kind of interesting to reflect upon that.
I think that's what I liked about the fact with the 8 scenarios, they weren't all the same, in that if you took the alternative one or two of the alternative Midway decisions, it wasn't that suddenly the battle is completely reversed and the Americans are completely defeated. You kind of left it more of an ambiguous kind of draw situation, which at the time might have been acceptable, because when you think about what had been happening in the Pacific campaign, a draw might have been okay. Well, it's like it's the Operation Goodwood thing in Normandy, isn't it? Everybody would like a clear victory, but actually sometimes when you look at the grand scheme of things, a draw isn't necessarily too bad. You're still in the game. And I think that was one of the things that I kind of was surprised, that some of the alternative outcomes weren't cataclysmic. They were just, it was kind of, okay, so that leads us down potentially another path there. Maybe things take a bit longer, but it doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly the Allies are out of the war, or it just it just changes things enough to kind of make you think, oh, that's interesting, that because we perceive of these certain situations in the way we do it. Say the Russian scenario, the Soviet scenario you put in there was, as you said, they're kind of more fictionally based, although you do use real quotes by people talking about similar situations to kind of give it a validity. But the Midway one was kind of rooted in, these are the genuine options available. And I think over the course of the 8, it made me question, as you say, how did people make these decisions? And we have a tendency, I think, us who love military history, to, when we've made we've decided on our camp, we go with, I like this general, I think he got it wrong. We tend to then kind of vilify the person we think got it wrong. But you always manage to, with this, make them seem like, but actually look at why he made that decision. You go, yeah, actually, I feel more sympathy now, and it doesn't necessarily seem like the wrong decision, because it can just be not quite as right as the right decision, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the other things that came out of it, and you're right to highlight the Midway one. The more I played with it, the more I thought, actually, that the most likely outcome of it just being slightly different, or the Americans not buying into the idea, or going all in to catch the Japanese at Midway, is a draw. And it's even if they had lost and it had been in exchange for a couple of carriers each or something like that, it doesn't materially affect the long-term outcome of the war. And that was one that was interesting, in that by making the choice and making the judgment, Nimitz's call on this, perhaps more than anybody, so in the end gets it absolutely right. He recognizes and takes the calculated risk, option that he gives to Spruance and Fletcher, and that really pays off, and it really falls into place. And yes, okay, the Japanese made some tactical errors and things, but it was kind of the way the Japanese fleet had been functioning so far. So, but what was interesting, that if the Americans hadn't quite got it right, you get a kind of a fudge. I didn't see it being an utter disaster. The one thing that I tried to squeeze in was an extra scenario or an extra option in that scenario, where the Japanese are light on the fact that they've been fooled, and so they spring the trap the other way. And there is a kind of a plausibility to that. There is enough evidence that a properly functioning intelligence gathering and analyzing system may well have identified that the Americans are up to something here. They seem to be giving the game away, that the whole thing about, we haven't got any, the water's not
the fresh water supply on the island, AEF and all that.
Yeah, and there's an increase in American military radio traffic in and around that area. So it's kind of and some of the American planes were flying longer patrols in the period leading up to it. So it's kind of a giveaway. There's enough there that if you had a decent functioning Japanese intelligence structure, they may have hang on, they seem to know we're coming, or there's a possibility here. Maybe then the Japanese spring the trap, and that's disaster scenario for the Americans. If the Japanese are on the ball, the Americans get stuffed, and they lose really badly. And someone else had played with that idea. I read a chapter somewhere where somebody raised that as an option, but it didn't quite fit in because it's actually very implausible. Japanese intelligence gathering and use of intelligence was really dramatically
consistently bad, wasn't it? Yeah.
And they don't put enough emphasis on it, and it's not regarded highly in the way that Western armed forces see the value of intelligence and boffins and technology and so on. And the Japanese, but also German approaches are very martial based, and it's about frontline fighting capacity. So although it was a nice idea, I'm not sure it was entirely plausible in the situation. The other thing that came out of it, I think, and you're right to highlight, I think it's quite interesting, is that most of these decisions, in the end, it's like dropping a pebble into a stream. The flow shifts, but not much is going to change the entire course of the war. One or two of them do. That if Halifax does a deal in 1940 and gets Britain out of the war and trades off various things in the Mediterranean, which I kind of call, I call in writing the Treaty of Rome. They go to Rome to negotiate with the Italians, and the Germans are there. And then afterwards reflect on the fact that the Treaty of Rome is something quite different. It's the foundation of the European Union, ultimately. But I didn't kind of twig that initially, but you see the logical place for where that would be. That's kind of a catastrophic option, because you end up, this is what kind of Churchill's moment of genius, or your really real grip in 1940, is to see that the only way a deal at that time will ultimately be disastrous for Western interests, both American ultimately, but also British, French, and so on. It's a disaster scenario. If you hand a deal to the Germans at that time, you don't win much out of the Second World War. And I think one thing that came out of that was the idea that Churchill has a kind of romantic bulldog spirit in 1940, and he's kind of fuzzy, but he has the heart of it all. Whereas Halifax has the brains doing the deal, the logic and the rationale, the clever technician and so on. And the thing that came out of it for me was that's not actually the case. There's much more going on, and Halifax doesn't really have that grip of that particular decision. And that
I think that's the way you described that is very good, because I think I've always kind of thought of that 1940 scenario as kind of a heart or head one.
Yes.
Churchill's kind of going with his heart. Halifax is more with his head, but actually, as you said there's a lot more nuance to it than that. That's a simple way of looking at it, and it's not entirely flawed, but there are other levels to it. And again, when you're reading the book, folks, you kind of need to try and switch off some of the parts of your brain about what you know as the outcomes, and go, I'm going to try and really stick with what I know in 1940. And I like the way just before you have to make the decision, you remind people on the kind of the clipboard, here are the pros and here are the cons. And the fact is, there always are the pros and the cons, and you kind of reminded, because you go, that will make sense. Yes, but and here's the other point. And I was there was not with every one of them. I had my doubts. There was none that I just went, I'm going with this because I know. You managed to make me question myself and question my knowledge. And I guess if that's the fundamental aim, is if you can make people who know a bit about this stop and go, actually, that's a really good point there, then I guess you've done your job.
Yes, and it's a balance between the two, isn't it? Because people watching the channel and so on will be that they're informed, they know what the outcomes of all of this is going to be, but not everyone reading it will be. So they'll be led to it in a kind of in a different way. They'll know broadly the outcomes of some of them, but not all of them. But informed readers, I think there's something, because I found something by doing it, made me rethink certain things in a way that you just take as read, or you form your view, as you just said. You have a view on something, and that's it. You've worked it out. But actually, when you reflect on it and you're forced to go through the process of it, well, maybe not. And so it's interesting, Jen, then just to think, well, you can see why they might have been led in a slightly different direction at a different moment. And that was kind of interesting and fun to do, really. And so it's there's always been a snootiness. I noticed one of the comments where somebody said about counterfactual history has been a bit, regarded as being not proper history and so on. I don't buy that at all. I've always found it fascinating and interesting. I love all the kind of counterfactual what if history films or books and things like the Roth's book on the plot against America and the Man in the High Castle and all that kind of stuff. Now, some of it is real fantasy stuff, but some of it makes you think about consequences, about outcomes, and it's always interesting. It's kind of an intellectual exercise to make you think about potential consequences and key moments. They're not always, big decisions are not always earth-shattering in terms of completely changing the flow of a war or history, but they can make fundamental differences to how history plays out a little bit. And what's interesting, that only a few of the scenarios in the book lead you in a direction which dramatically changes the outcome of the war. Most cases, they just kind of steer it a slightly different direction, and it goes back to the flow of what the history had been. And that in itself was quite interesting. No matter how much you play with it, you're kind of constrained by the realities of the war and how it plays out and why it plays out in the way that it does. There are big drivers, and there are shaping parameters, are the right expressions, which funnel the war in a particular direction, and the process by which decisions were historically made would play out in other ways, even if you shift the direction slightly. And that was kind of quite interesting. But if it makes people who know the history just to reflect upon the decisions and think about, well, I've always thought they should have done that, and it can, it seemed like a dumb decision. And actually, when you look at it, well, you can see why they did it. It may have ended up being a dumb decision. I mean, the whole point about sending large numbers of forces to Greece in 1941 is clearly a disaster, and it goes badly wrong. It doesn't send the right signals to anybody, certainly not to the Greeks. The Turks, well, I'm not sure the Turkish government at the time would have ever sided with the Axis in the war. They play a very careful and very shrewd game, and the
president. I did a show about Turkey's neutrality last week with on or Izzy, the Turkish historian, and I was actually really surprised how, again, nuanced the political thinking was in Turkey, and how he was reminding me politely that as a Brit, I've read mostly about Britain's relationship with Turkey, and he was presenting the Soviet Union's relationship with Turkey and Germany's, and you realize that they're kind of playing against at least three, because there's the Middle East as well going on there. And actually, you realize there were situations where it could have gone that way, and there's a lot of pressure coming on from different people, and it was kind of mind-blowing to me how little about that I knew. And I think, going back to what you're saying about the purpose behind the book as well, is that the older I get, the more I need to be reminded to stop thinking the way I've always thought, or at least if I am thinking the way I've always thought, why can I justify why I've always thought that way? Can I, if someone says, my stepdaughter will say to me, why do you like that music again? I go, well, because, and sometimes you realize you can't really come up with just because it was when I was 17, it makes me feel young again. But you can't kind of come up with a reason beyond that in some ways. Or why do you like that film? And you go, well, and anything that causes you to just kind of go through your own process and understand the logical process and the intellectual process, I think is a good thing, because we've talked about on this channel a lot. We do tend to, I think, some of us like histories that confirm what we already think, so we can kind of put on our metaphorical pipe and go, yes, I knew that. Yes, I've got, and we don't. We say we like to be challenged, but in many ways we don't really want to be challenged. And I think without challenging people too much, you are just helping to make people second guess and reconsider some of these pivotal decisions. And as you say, it wasn't probably going to change the outcome of the war, but it just changes the flow a little bit. I have to know, what were the scenarios that you wished you'd put in, or if you were going to do a volume 2, were there any that you write up to a kind of deadline day, you thought, oh my God, I wish I could have fitted that one in?
I think there is something about, I really wanted in some ways to do one in where Britain is invaded in 1940. There's a collapse and the Germans actually get into the UK. But it's been kind of, lots of people have done it. It's been portrayed in lots of films, and so I ruled it out for that particular reason, that it's been done in lots of different ways. And I remember many years ago, a TV documentary company came to me and said, we're doing something about how Britain might have fallen in 1940. And at the time, I said, well, I don't think they could. I don't think it was ever going to happen. And I didn't push it particularly very far. So it wasn't the answer they wanted. So they went in a different direction, asked someone else who did come up with a plausible reason as to how a scenario in which Britain might have folded. And that kind of idea about that scenario, because it's been done before, and I'm not wholly convinced that there is a really good way in which Britain is invaded. They might have done a deal, and they might have made a political failure. I think that is more plausible. Would have been interesting. I toyed with the idea of the Germans doing something more successful with the Ardennes offensive in 1944, but it didn't really work. And the one thing I didn't want to do, and some of them would have worked in a way, was Axis decision making having an impact on what the Allies did. So if the Germans or the Japanese had done something different, what was their thinking? What was their motivation? But the problem then, although it creates some nice scenarios, it also then leads you into how do you get the Nazis or the Axis forces to win the war? And I didn't really want to go down that avenue. I don't know why, but there's a part.
I think it's a bit morally dubious as well, isn't it? In some ways, if you're starting to play the role of some of the German commanders, because as we know, even the ones that we used to think of as being kind of untarnished by the horrors, most of them were, had their fingers in some pretty evil pies, to use a bad analogy there. So it's an odd one to do.
Yeah, and I know there's a whole genre of secret weapons for the SS and wonder weapons and what ifs around in Germany and so on, but I don't know, I just didn't want to go there really. It was something, whenever I used to play war games as a kid, I always wanted to be the Allies or the Soviets. I never wanted to be the Germans. I don't know why, because of those kind of things maybe. So I didn't want to explore that, but it would have opened up some scenarios. The other one, which was interesting, would have been if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. But that leads you, that's an active decision on the part of the Japanese, not on the part of the Allies. I tried to do something where American foreign policy might not have pushed in the direction, and then the consequences of that, and what that would have been. But it just didn't work in terms of it was too reactive rather than an active series of decisions that the Americans. But I know the Americans. American foreign policy and cutting off the oil and so on in 1940-41 has a dramatic effect on Japan's decision-making process. But to me, the Japanese were going to go at some point for some kind of offensive somewhere, probably against Southeast Asia, and maybe that have kept the Americans out of the war. I don't know. I just didn't see how it could work in terms of how you'd make the Allies the active decision-making.
Yeah.
People
and I thought again, I thought when I heard about the book that maybe you would be putting the decisions at a lower level, kind of brigade commanders or even battalion commanders. But then the problem with that is that if you're training current serving military, they have a whole lot of skill sets that the average reader of your book won't have. So you have to then take into account, but these people, a battalion commander will be trained to know how to use tanks in conjunction with armor or know how to do a flanking maneuver. And so but you can't present scenarios to a general readership where they don't have that. And again, going back to the Churchill and Halifax one, you can read your book and you don't have to understand what it is to be an MP. You're put in this very basic decision between this option and that option. You don't need to have much prior kind of informational skills to do it. You're just making it with common sense, essentially. And I think that makes it very accessible for anybody, regardless whether they're a World War II buff, a history buff, a novice, an expert. Everyone, I think, will get something out of it because it just challenges the way you fundamentally make decisions, which I think is extraordinary. We did have a question earlier about the title of the book. Can you defeat the Nazis? Someone saying it's a little bit kind of commando comic. Was that? Did you have lots of options for that? Was it kind of?
You're at the mercy of the publishers, and I quite rightly pointed out that it's not just about the Nazis. It's, you know, the Italians are there. The Japanese are a considerable part of the forces that the Allies are fighting. And I wanted to, you know, something along the lines of about how to win the Second World War or something like that. But as ever, if you put Nazis on there, it grabs people's attention.
Yeah, it's gonna draw people in. I'm constantly being told that I should put what's more secret, undiscovered, mega in my titles of my shows, and I'm stubbornly not going down that path, even though logic probably tells me if I named everything the undiscovered hidden story of the secret zone, so the YouTube algorithm would kick in for me. But yeah, that's kind of marketing. But so again, I think there's no real particular questions coming up. People are talking about decision making generally, but you know, it is an interesting thing that, as you know, as someone who teaches history, but also you have this interest in wargaming and scenarios. And the other thing I wanted to bring in is that idea of luck as well, and just things happening that are completely random, because there's only a certain amount of decision making that you can make. But because there are these just things that will happen, which is why even in the most sophisticated wargaming, but West Point at Sanders, they still use dice. They still use a certain amount of, and here's something that's coming that we're not expected. How did you consider kind of putting in that quality of just randomness?
There is an element of randomness because there are always factors you can't control and you can't foresee, and that's always been the criticism. And there's some justification. It's about the whole idea of using counterfactual history. That if by tweaking one thing, there are so many different splinters and different possibilities that come from just one change that you can't control it. You can't control it. You can't decide what may or may not happen. And basically, you just have to, in the confines of a book like that, you have to make those random choices yourself and decide what looks plausible here. So with the way in which they use kind of strategy games in training processes, I mean, it's one of the problems. If you have dice, if you have rules, the players will exploit the rules. They'll find weaknesses in it and find a way around it. If you have umpires who make the choices, which is effectively what I've done in the book, you're then at the mercy of, do the umpires know what they're doing? You know, they think in a particular kind of way. And so there's a limit to kind of the randomness you could put in. So I didn't go completely random, but I did try to think, in some cases, there could have been 2 or 3 possibilities. And so what I tried to do was that at one point in the scenario, you're presented with this possibility, but another decision might lead you in a different direction, which could have also been led to by the previous one as well. So I tried to offer different ways or different routes in which different options could have ended up from a similar kind of choice. So you can explore all of them. I mean, the point about luck is a fascinating one. I once pitched to an undergraduate group that there's no such thing as luck. I mean, just to stir it up a little bit in terms of that, you know, the kind of what the outcome in history and war and so on. And there's something in it, I think, in that luck is it all strikes me that I don't know why I use football analogies, but people say that when you have a penalty shootout in the World Cup or something like that, you can't train for it. And it's a kind of element of luck. And that's clearly not true. You can, and you can limit the possibilities of the pressure or the luck element, if you want, playing out. I mean, the same applies in decision-making and the way in which outcomes in war unfold, or in the Second World War unfold. It's not lucky in most cases that the Allies end up making most of the better decisions during the war. It's because their structures, their organizations, their decision-making methods are better for the bigger picture in the long term. Yes, the Axis forces have great strength in immediate short-term military decision-making, gripping things on the battlefield. And they're clearly better at that at certain times and seizing opportunities in the early stages of the war. But the bigger picture is that the bigger decisions can be controlled by limiting the chances or bad luck or something going wrong by controlling the environment as much as possible.
Yeah.
And it can go too far, but I mean, you know, we often discuss it about Monty, that he limits the chance of things going wrong, because he's cautious, he's controlled. You stick to a plan, you minimize risk in order to ensure that you win. Now, if you know that you've got all those big advantages and ultimately you will get a win, then you stick to it, don't you?
It's the law of averages, isn't it? If you stick to the kind of safe, reasonably safe, with a little bit of risk kind of element all the way over the course of a war, you kind of, it's why when people study things like Grenada in '83 or whatever it was too short to really get any kind of enough decisions made to analyze even kind of the first Iraq war. But with World War II, you can, as you said there, over the course of 6 years, say, okay, the British, the Allies did make a few bad decisions, but we made a hell of a lot more. In fact, I think it was maybe Richard Holmes said to me years ago, one of the times I met him, that the side that wins is the side that makes the least mistakes, as opposed to making the most right decisions. And it's that other way of looking at it, is that we may not have made, we didn't get through the war without making some bad decisions, but the enemy made even more bad decisions than we did. And it's like that. And I'm going to use another sporting analogy, is that thing, those individual sports like diving or gymnastics, those sports people can do a 10 routine because they do it in training all the time. And what happens on the day is they wobble there, they do that bit there, and points get knocked off. And that's sort of how the armies approach World War II, is they can do it well, but on the day things will go wrong. The things that you can predict, like, you know, you could have controlled, like moving your own troops, maybe you didn't move them fast enough, but there's the things you can't control, like fog bank moving in, or the weather changing, or whatever, or intelligence failure or something like that. But over the course of the whole war, as you know, there's enough good decisions being made that, as you said, that the flow of the war is not really going to change. It's just the individual scenarios will change the outcome for a few weeks or months, or steer things to another theater a little bit. But
I mean, it's all one of the classic what ifs. Looking at it from the opposite point of view, if the Germans hadn't done certain things, like the invasion of Russia, or they'd done something different and all that kind of thing. And yes, if you unpick that one particular element of that part of the war out of this, you can make a plausible case for that. But the reality is, the Germans, under Hitler's direction and the Nazi direction, the way they saw the world and that kind of warped mentality and so on, they wouldn't have been in the position in early 1941 without having that drive, that great risk-taking, throwing caution to the wind. They're forced into a position having to do that. And because of elements of real skill and capability on certain commanders at certain times, and they're really good at seizing moments and opportunity to get themselves into a really good position, on the face of it anyway, by the spring of 1941. So to say then, well, let's now change that and think in a much different kind of way, it doesn't work. You have to take the whole package of how Germany or Axis powers make decisions during the war. You can't suddenly turn an instinctive kind of visceral approach to the way in which war is conducted that the Germans have used in the early stages of war under Hitler's direction, and suddenly turn into this considered, thoughtful, clever kind of Roosevelt Marshall kind of approach. It doesn't work. They're not like that. So you have to take the whole package.
And I'm with you on that. But, you know, when people say they shouldn't have invaded Russia, you're saying it like the alternative is they would do nothing. Because if they hadn't done that, they'd have done something else on a similar scale. It would have been a different time of year or a different direction, but to think they would have done nothing at all. And you reminded me of that with the Market Garden chapter. You know, I did a show with James Daly a few weeks ago about all the cancelled operations between Overlord and Market Garden. I'm now firmly of the opinion that whether or not Market Garden would have happened, an operation involving an airborne army would have taken place before the end of the year, because they were all ready to go. And at some point, someone would have pulled the trigger, metaphorically speaking. And it might have been a bigger operation, a smaller operation, slightly later, slightly earlier. But to think there would have been no ambitious airborne operation at that time of the war, I think is the wrong way to think. It's just, so when we talk about what it shouldn't have happened, you have to therefore propose what would have happened instead then, because something not happening just means that something else is going to happen in its place.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as you said at the beginning, you're then into the multiple different things changing, and you're suddenly everything's changed because 2 years of decisions have gone a different way. But again, we're bringing this idea of examination of why things happen, putting yourself in that position and going, well, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, which I think is your aim. So you talked a little bit about the feedback. You were on with James now last night. You're on with me tonight. Was there any kind of pushback from the academic community saying you shouldn't be doing this? It's too much kind of the Dungeons and Dragons thing. You've sold out, John.
I'll probably get that at some point. And I mean, a couple of colleagues at work. Actually, to be fair, there've been one of my colleagues at work, Steve Badsey, who's done counterfactual stuff before, and he's quite in favour of it. Gary Sheffield, who's the First World War historian, said, if only I'd thought of doing that on the First World War. So. And another colleague of mine, Spencer Jones, has done quite a bit on First World War counterfactual stuff. I think he's contributed to this kind of thing. We've done this kind of thing at work. So within the confines of our small little world of the military history department, war studies department at my institute, it'll be fine, of course. But I mean, lots of historians have played with these kind of ideas, and it's not entirely tongue-in-cheek as a book. That I'm not trying to make big serious points, but it's just kind of stir things up a little bit with making us think about certain things and reflect a little bit upon how decisions are made. So it is just pushing that. There is the kind of idea, I mean, the publishers are big on the idea that this is a stocking filler book for dads and uncles and so on at Christmas. Fine, if some people who are not as interested and informed about the Second World War, like us guys and us people who are watching this, that's fine. If it draws some other people in, maybe, and I'm right. I'm glad you made the point about you don't have to know about the Second World War in great detail in order to read it and try and get something out of it. And that was kind of the aim of it. I wanted some of it to be a little bit where you're in the heat of battle making key decisions. So the Market Garden one and the Midway one capture that perhaps a little bit more, maybe the North African one when O'Connor's in that moment about whether or not to go to Tripoli and ignore or not wait for advice and so on and just to go for it. So there are a few moments like that. But if you got into more of the technicalities, you rightly say, about manoeuvring units around or what to do, it's going to lose a wider readership. And it's trying to make a few points about the war, make those who know something about it reflect on some parts of it a little bit, or to explore and have a bit of fun with it, but also to draw some other people in. I'm sure there'll be some kickback of some historians who really don't like counterfactual history at all, but I've always enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It's made me think about certain things about the Second World War slightly differently. My view on Marshall Brooke debate changed. For example, that was quite interesting. And I mean, some of the other elements made, and the point about Turkey, that's really interesting. I didn't know a great deal about it before I started doing this, but I wanted to push the idea. And the more I read into it, it started to highlight, well, you can see where Turkey's coming from with this, and so those kind of things.
Essentially, it's trying to see other people's opinions, isn't it? And also trying to have some empathy for people as well, I think, because when in my touring life, when people come at it and say, oh, this general made a bad decision, you go, yeah, but that general was on, maybe have been doing it for years. They weren't intending to get anything wrong. Their motivations were always honest. They were always trying to bring ends to a war, and just saying they got it wrong is. There's a scenario where I was at a particular place in Normandy, and another guy I didn't know was talking about someone very negatively, a colonel, in fact, in a particular regiment, and the colonel's son had happened to have been in Normandy a week before, touring with a friend of mine, and I wanted to say to this guide, would you be prepared to say what you're saying about this colonel in front of that colonel's son, if that colonel's son, who had been at that same spot a week earlier? Because I said, I bet you wouldn't. I didn't say it, but I bet you wouldn't say that. I bet you'd be much more tactful, and you'd say things, well, of course, they were suffering under duress, and they were tired, and the burden of command, and the fact they'd seen the metaphorical body bags closed up in previous campaigns, and there's the weight of responsibility, and now say that person made the wrong decision. And I think that to be reminded of the weight on these people, I think, is very important as well. And also, you said there that you don't need to be a military expert, because in a weird way, the 8 decisions, because some of them have several decisions, there's kind of two or three types. There's the stick or twist one, isn't there? The kind of the go. There's the head or heart kind of ones, but broadly they kind of come down to two or three categories. That kind of, and we all can identify with that. We've all been into a penny arcade with a couple of quid and got a little around. You think, oh, shall I put it? Oh, I've lost it. We've all been in that. Shall I walk away now and get fish and chips, or shall I? And we've all been there, and everyone can relate to that kind of head or heart thing. We look at it with current politics. You see people go, I kind of like that person, but my head is telling me that person who I don't really like has got more of a sound idea. So we understand as human beings those basic kind of decision principles. And I think you managed to kind of bring up some very complicated scenarios down to kind of very basic, stick or twist. I think is the Midway. Sorry, the O'Connor one. I think is a perfect example of a stick or twist moment. You've drawn 18. If you get a 3, you get 21 and you win. But or do you stick?
And it is no, that's really interesting, and that's absolutely. And there are, and I think the empathy thing for the people making the decisions under the pressures that are under, you can often see why they end up making those decisions. Okay, in retrospect, you can see that they're wrong, and sometimes you can be critical of the motivators, the motivating factors about why they do certain things at certain times, but not very often. These I've always had. I'm sure, like you, immense respect to the people who are making critical decisions which involve potential loss of life, the gambles that have to be taken, the crises that they're facing, the pressures playing upon them. I wouldn't be like to make decisions of that nature, and it's a certain you get a respect at times for those, even for people who. On the Allied side as well, as where you look and you think that they come across in the literature not very nice people, and it's not somebody you'd want to spend a lot of time with, but you can still have that respect for their grip, their determination, the fact they're willing to put themselves into these positions where they have to make crucial decisions on which big changes in the war are going to unfold from those moments, and that takes a special kind of person. And even just to reflect upon that is interesting. And sometimes, you can see just in this book, but in lots of other cases, you start to reflect on, I can see where they're now coming from. I can understand a little bit about the pressures playing upon them and the difficulties they're confronting. Some of them are just, I know in Star Trek, Captain Kirk said he doesn't believe in the no-win scenario. And he fiddles the figures, so he gets away with it in one of the films. But in real life, there are some no-win scenarios, and it's kind of you're searching for the potentially the least worst option in these.
I've always been a proponent of the often commanders are not faced with an obviously good option and obviously bad one. There are two, and one is the least shit one.
Yes.
And that's with hindsight often tells you which one is the least shit one. At the time you're making it, there's an unknown element to it that you kind of, again, you're armed with a certain amount of facts, but that every one of these decisions that in the book is reminding me that they do not know the complete picture. They know they have a lot of information. They have a lot of previous experience. They went the Churchill Halifax one, they know a lot about their past, they know that, but there's still an unknown quality about it. So you have to make a decision on kind of part logic and then part, I don't know, gut instinct. What does my logic tell me? And again, that respect, I think, is something we need to be reminded of again. And again, if anyone screws up in your book, you just go back and start the other scenario. You don't, no one's died. You may have thrown it across the room and hit the cat possibly, but as long as the cat doesn't, suffer any serious injury, there's no loss to a life there, and you can go back. I've learned from that, and I now understand why that was the wrong decision. Oh well, chapter 3.
Yes, I mean that's an interesting point in when you can have game scenarios and role plays and things. But they're not when you take on those roles and you're thinking through those processes, you're not playing for keeps in terms of the outcome of it. So if you're in command, I mean, a couple of times I've seen this in strategy games where we've got people in charge of, I don't know, battleships, or they're about a fleet, and they're presented with an option where, well, go down fighting, death or glory, and they go steaming. And you say, would you have done that if you knew that this is going to result in mass death and likely destruction? Or would you have taken the shrewd option and withdrawn in order to fight another day and seek out an alternative, a different way of doing something? And it makes you think differently then, your reactions are somewhat different. And as you say, in real life, you can't go back to chapter 3 and section 4 and let's try this option. You've got it wrong, or it's not ended as you wanted, and you've got to deal with that. It makes you think differently, and decision-making process without those extra pressures are somewhat different. So you can only ever get a flavour of this.
Yeah, and that's, I was going to make that point when you used the penalty shootout analogy earlier, is that in theory, yes, it isn't something where luck is involved, but it's as footballers have explained, it is that inherent pressure. Now, it's not the same pressure that Harry Truman is facing in 1945 or Eisenhower, but there's a stadium of 50,000 watching you. There's X million watching you around the world, and everybody's watching you run up that ball. You've got to kick in there. I can completely understand that the mental pressures you're under there and what's going through your brain now and all that. Well, I can't really understand because I've never been in that situation, but I can try and put myself in a situation where there's all that extra pressure on, and that's just in a sporting environment. But in as you said there, in the environment of World War II or warfare, I was reading it in bed. I was reading it. My feet were nice and warm. I had macaroni and cheese. I think the night I read the first chapter, I was nice and full. I hadn't seen my friend die the day before. I hadn't had to write a letter to a grieving widow explaining about someone that we both knew has been killed, so on and so forth. And so I could make these conversations in a kind of place from relative calm. And again, without having kind of a spider jump out at you on page 7 to get your heart rate up, you can't possibly recreate the real conditions of the weight of these decisions. But it does. It's an interesting intellectual exercise. And I think that's the point. So, well, I think we'll bring things to an end in a minute there. But it's available right now, isn't it? It's available for purchase.
It is, yeah. Out there now, in all good bookshops and some bad ones as well, I guess. But there you go. And
so the links in the description below. I do urge, but it is a good stocking filler, and I don't mean that in a kind of negative way. It's that kind of ideal where anybody who's got a vague interest in military history, whether they're at the beginning or you're going to get something out of it. And as I say, I want to just stress the fact you don't need to come into this armed with a general's qualifications and understanding about how troop movements. It just comes down to simple kind of gut instinct decisions. Well, not simple in the sense that they're binary. There's a left option or right option, but not simple in the sense of the outcome and the weight of responsibility. So I think it's going to be really good. We had a question: there's an audio book option as well? Yes,
I believe so. I believe there is. Yeah. There's Kindle, audio, and hardback. Paperback next year, I believe, is the deal.
And in terms of you, John, obviously you're still teaching, but what's the world looking like? Are you going to start bringing groups to battlefields again next year, do you hope? Is the horizon looking a bit better in terms of travel?
Yeah, the plan is that we've got some students signed up at the moment, tentatively, to come back to Normandy at the end of March, early April next year. And so we'll be running a field trip, hopefully there. So that'll be a mixed group of undergraduate and postgrad. So we'll get back to, because we've missed it for a couple of years. I missed my first one, actually, our departmental trip. I started with some colleagues. Peter Caddick Adams, for example, was on one of the very early ones, first ones that we did. And so we started donkeys years ago, and we run it every year. I missed one just before the pandemic hit, and then we've obviously had to miss the last 2. So we're hoping to be there. We want to get back, want to get a student, and the students really look forward to it. So it's a key part of what we do. We would still hope to do a market garden one at some point in the future. We just started. We did a couple of them in the last few years. But there's a limit to what you can get students to stump up. There's still an amount of money, and we still have kind of worries and concerns about confined spaces, taking students and traveling in a coach all the way down to Portsmouth and the ferry, and you know the deal far better than I.
No, I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet, but I think the horizon's looking better. But just one last question. You talked about the difficulty that you've been revisiting some of the decisions about with regards to the book, but generally this last 18 months, 2 years of your routine being disrupted, and the world we've been living in of podcasts and YouTube channels, and has your changing about World War II evolved? I mean, I can certainly speak for me. I'm a completely different place in my understanding of World War II now than I was 18 months ago.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the experience of the last 18 months, it's obviously been difficult in so many different ways and about how we've done things. But one thing that's come out of searching for positives, but these are positives, things like this and the podcasts and the YouTube channels and things. This has been really positive, and I think people were into those things beforehand. But what's happened over the last 18 months, 2 years, has really grown our awareness and the use with which people can gain a better understanding of subjects. I was never really big into podcasts at all until about 18 months ago. Now I think they're fantastic, or YouTube channels and things like that. I'm watching them all the time. I'm engaging with them. And I think it's a really good way of interacting and learning a great deal. So I think that's been a positive. So my understanding of what's available and the enthusiasm and the interest, I think it's in a way that you kind of I didn't get beforehand. You know, I always think people are interested in the subject, and like I am, but what we've got from these kind of things is a much greater awareness of how many other people are out there and how well informed people are.
Yeah, and differing ideas. I think we'd all been a little bit guilty of living in kind of echo chambers where we kind of met. I mean, my circle of friends was Normandy tour guides who, because we're living here and doing what we did, although we have different ideas, we kind of thought some things the same way. The Wolverhampton environment where you are, people may be coming. But being able to interact as I do now and you do with people in Australia and India and people who are amateur historians, professional historians at the beginning of their careers, the variety of viewpoints has been astonishing. And again, how much knowledge there is out there, because I was of the opinion, because of some of mainstream TV, is that because everything's sort of dumbed down a bit, is that everybody out there is complete idiots when it comes to World War II. But I don't think they are at all. I know they're not. There's a lot of people who know an incredible amount of stuff, are incredibly well read, and they want to get better. They want to understand. They don't feel their journey is over. I think there are some people, we talked about that. I know how Market Garden went wrong, and no amount of dynamite's going to change their opinion about who their villain is. But a lot of people are actually very open to being challenged about who their villains and heroes are and what their ideas are, and that's all for the better. But anyway, I'll just remind people what we're coming up to, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, 2 more shows for you tomorrow. Don't forget, we're Australia week, so the next show tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Dr. Carl James is coming to talk about the Australian involvement on Bougainville, which is going to be fantastic. And then 9 p.m. UK time, Philip Bradley's coming on to talk about D-Day in New Guinea. So 2 really good Australian shows about the Pacific. That's tomorrow. But right now, thank you very much, John Buckley, for joining us. Good luck with the book. I've got my copy. I enjoy it. People are saying they've already bought it or receiving it, so that's great. And good luck with it. And we'll have you back on sometime next year to talk about something else, or hopefully I'll meet you up meet you in Normandy for a pint of something somewhere or other.
That would be the best option. I would really look forward to that.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. This is Paul Willard for World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you very much for your time today.